Imagine it is the morning of March 12th, 1991. You are a 44-year-old factory foreman living in Minsk, in what is still, just barely, the Soviet Union. Your apartment is a 3-room flat on the 5th floor of a concrete block building that looks exactly like the one beside it, and the one beside that, and the 17 blocks of identical buildings stretching down the street in both directions. You have lived there for 19 years. The rent is almost nothing. Your job at the tractor factory is guaranteed. The state has told you and your father before you, and his father before him, that this is how things work. You show up, you do your part. The state provides for the rest. Your wife is a nurse at a public hospital 12 minutes away on foot. Between the two of you, you earn just enough to fill the refrigerator most weeks. There is rarely meat. There is usually bread. There is almost always a line for both. This morning, like most mornings, you leave for work before your children wake, stepping over the worn patch in the hallway carpet that the building manager said he would fix 4 months ago and still has not. If you have ever wondered why the most powerful planned economies in human history all eventually collapsed, why countries with enormous natural resources, educated populations, and disciplined workforces somehow ended up with empty shelves, worthless currencies, and millions of people fleeing on foot, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a political argument. It is an economic one. It is a mechanism. It has operated in every country that tried this system, in every decade, on every continent. And it always ends the same way. If this kind of historical clarity is valuable to you, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of the patterns that most people never see until it is already too late. On that March morning in 1991, there is a line outside your local bread shop. There is almost always a line. But today, the line is longer than usual, stretching past the pharmacy and around the corner. The shelves inside, a neighbor tells you, are nearly empty. This is not new, but it is getting worse. In August of this year, hardliners in Moscow will attempt a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, the reforming Soviet leader who has been trying to fix a system that increasingly resists being fixed. The coup will fail, but the Union will not survive the attempt. By December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev will resign from his position as president of the Soviet Union. The red flag over the Kremlin will be lowered for the last time, and you, a man whose entire life was organized around the certainties of the Soviet system, will wake up in a new country, facing a new economy, with savings in rubles that are about to become worth almost nothing. This video is about why that happened, not just in the Soviet Union, but in every country that has tried to run its economy through central planning and state ownership on a large scale. It is about the specific economic mechanism that makes such systems fail, not eventually, not maybe, but reliably and predictably, in the same sequence, through the same stages, regardless of the ideology of the leaders or the natural wealth of the land. The mechanism has a name, and once you understand it, you will never look at the promise of a managed economy the same way again. Before we go further, there is something important to understand about how this failure actually works. Most people think socialist economies fail because of bad people or bad luck, corrupt leaders, foreign interference, unfavorable oil prices, a drought. And while those factors can accelerate a collapse, they are not the root cause. The cause is something deeper and more structural, something that operates like a slow leak in the hull of a ship at sea. The water rises so gradually that passengers assume they are simply experiencing a rough weather, right up until the moment the bow goes under and there is nothing left to do. In 1920, an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises published an essay that most of the world ignored at the time. Its title was Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. His argument was simple and, to anyone who followed it to its conclusion, devastating. He said that without private ownership of the means of production, meaning the factories, the farms, the tools, the machines that make things, without private ownership of these things, there can be no genuine prices. And without genuine prices, no one, not the most gifted planner with the most powerful calculating machine ever built, can know what anything is truly worth or where it is most urgently needed. Think about prices the way you think about traffic signals in a city. In a city with working traffic signals, tens of thousands of drivers make decisions every minute about when to accelerate, when to stop, when to turn. They never need to call a central authority to coordinate with each other. The signal does the coordinating. It gathers information from the actual flow of vehicles and translates that information into a simple, immediate instruction. In a free market, prices do the same thing for an entire economy. When a good becomes scarce, its price rises. That rising price sends 2 signals simultaneously. It tells producers that making more of that good is now more profitable, so they shift resources toward it, and it tells consumers that they should use less of it while it is expensive. Billions of individual decisions, across millions of participants, coordinated silently and constantly through the single mechanism of the price. When a government takes over an economy and replaces market prices with prices set by decree, it does not improve on the system. It disables it. It is like replacing every traffic signal in a major city with a single committee of bureaucrats sitting in a room, trying to manually direct every intersection at once, using information that is already hours or days out of date by the time it reaches the room. The result is not smoother traffic. It is gridlock. Shortages in some places, surpluses in others, goods rotting in warehouses while people queue for them in the next city over, and a gradual, irreversible deterioration in the productive capacity of the entire system. This is not a theoretical prediction. It is what happened, documented in precise detail in country after country across the 20th century. Let us look at those countries now. This brings us directly to the first case study, the Soviet Union, the largest and most sustained experiment in central economic planning in human history, and one of the most instructive economic failures ever recorded. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia in October 1917, they inherited one of the world's largest territories, a population of over 150 million people, and some of the most abundant natural resources on Earth. They also inherited a country devastated by years of war. From the beginning, the strategy was state control of all production. All major industries were nationalized, which means taken over by the government. Prices were set not by supply and demand, but by planners in Moscow. Wages were determined by the state. What was produced, in what quantities, and where it was sent, all of these decisions were made by government officials rather than by the interaction of buyers and sellers in a market. This system was called a command economy, because commands from the government replaced the signals of the market. For a period, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s, it appeared to work on certain measures. The Soviet Union industrialized at remarkable speed. It built massive steel factories, dammed enormous rivers, and produced the weapons and equipment that eventually defeated Nazi Germany in the largest military conflict in history. By some measures, in the 1960s, the Soviet economy was the second largest in the world. This was genuinely impressive, but it masked a structural failure that was deepening with each passing decade. The economy was extraordinarily good at producing things the government decided to prioritize, particularly heavy industry and military hardware. It was terrible, systematically and irreversibly terrible, at producing things that ordinary people actually needed in their daily lives. Consumer goods, meaning everyday products like decent shoes, reliable appliances, fresh vegetables, or a car that did not take 10 years on a waiting list to obtain, were perpetually scarce. Economists estimated that the Soviet black market economy, the unofficial underground economy where people traded outside the official price system, equaled more than 10% of the country's official GDP. That black market did not exist because people were criminal by nature. It existed because the official system had become incapable of meeting basic human needs. People in Moscow and across the Soviet republics joined lines without knowing what was being sold on the assumption that if there was a line, something was available and something was better than nothing. They hoarded when they could because scarcity arrived without warning. Bread one week, soap the next, shoes the month after that, and nothing for weeks after that. By the 1980s, the structural weaknesses were accelerating into something that could no longer be hidden. The economy had been partially sustained throughout the 1970s by soaring oil prices, which gave the Soviet government access to hard foreign currency. When global oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, that lifeline was cut. Mikhail Gorbachev, who came to power in 1985, attempted reforms under the names Glasnost and Perestroika, which roughly translate as openness and restructuring. But reforms inside a system fundamentally hostile to the price mechanism are like repainting the hull of a sinking ship. By 1991, when the Union finally dissolved, the Soviet state bequeathed to its successor, the Russian Federation, a legacy of $66 billion in external debt and barely enough foreign exchange reserves to cover a few weeks of basic imports. After 7 decades and enormous sacrifices by hundreds of millions of people, the most ambitious socialist state in history had produced an economy generating less than half the real GDP per capita of the United States, despite a comparable population size. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. The Soviet Union had enormous oil reserves, a highly educated scientific community, and a military that could threaten any nation on Earth. Cuba has a medical and educational system that the world admires and extraordinary human capital. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. All of these countries had extraordinary natural advantages. Why did those advantages not translate into prosperity for ordinary people? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never look at carefully. It involves not just what went wrong, but how the same sequence unfolded across entirely different countries, different cultures, and different decades, always arriving at the same destination. This leads to the second case, and for this one, we go to Zimbabwe, beginning in the year 2000. Zimbabwe, in 1980, the year it gained independence from Britain, was one of the most agriculturally productive countries in all of Africa. It was called the breadbasket of the continent, which meant it grew far more food than its own population needed and exported the surplus to neighbors. Its capital, Harare, was a functioning modern city. Its currency, the Zimbabwean dollar at independence, was worth slightly more than the US dollar. The country had real and genuine potential. Robert Mugabe, who became prime minister in 1980 and later consolidated power as president, described himself as a socialist. His government believed that state direction of the economy, and most importantly, the redistribution of land from white commercial farmers to black Zimbabweans, was the path to justice and prosperity. The political argument for land reform had real historical legitimacy. Land ownership in Zimbabwe was deeply unequal, a direct legacy of colonial dispossession. But the execution was catastrophic for the economy. Beginning in 2000, the government sponsored and later endorsed the violent seizure of commercial farms, which were among the most productive agricultural operations anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa. These farms were handed to political allies and war veterans who had neither the capital equipment nor the technical experience required to maintain commercial-scale food production. Tobacco exports, which had been Zimbabwe's primary source of foreign currency, collapsed. Food production fell with them. The country that had fed much of southern Africa was now struggling to feed itself, and the cause was not a drought or a war, but the destruction, through political decree, of the productive system that had made the country an agricultural success in the first place. The government's response to the resulting shortages and falling revenues was to reach for the tools that socialist governments have historically reached for in this situation. It printed money to cover growing budget deficits, and it imposed price controls, meaning it made it illegal for businesses to charge more than a government-set price for basic goods. Price controls sound like protection for ordinary people. In practice, when a business is legally required to sell a product for less than it costs to produce, the business stops producing that product. Bread disappears from the shelves, not because there is no flour, but because no baker can afford to sell bread at the legal price without going bankrupt. By November 2008, Zimbabwe's annual inflation rate was estimated at 89.7 sextillion%. That is the number 89.7, followed by 20 zeros. Prices were doubling approximately every 24 hours. Between 1998 and 2008, Zimbabwe's per capita income collapsed from $1,640 per year to just 661. Life expectancy fell to 32 years for women and 34 for men. The breadbasket of Africa had become a country where hospitals could not function, where patients lay in corridors because there were no medicines or equipment, where a cholera epidemic spread because basic sanitation had broken down. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people look at Zimbabwe or the Soviet Union and see the result of bad leadership, of racial politics, of this ideology or that one. Those factors are real, but beneath them, invisible, operating with the indifferent regularity of a physical law, is the calculation problem working exactly as Mises predicted 7 decades before Zimbabwe's collapse. Remove the price signal. Replace it with commands. Watch the system go blind. And a blind economy cannot coordinate the millions of decisions required to keep people fed, housed, warm, and productive. If you are still here, you understand something that most people who hold strong opinions about economic systems have never seriously examined. Hit subscribe. Because the next section connects these patterns to a case that ran for over 60 years and is still unfolding today. Now we turn to Cuba, because Cuba offers perhaps the most complete and long-running case study available in what happens when a socialist economy is maintained not for a decade or two, but for over 6 decades, through multiple generations, with dedicated leadership and genuine belief in the system. When Fidel Castro took power in Cuba in January 1959, the island was not a poor country. Cuba in the 1950s had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America. Its GDP per capita was estimated to be roughly 80% above the regional average. Havana was a cosmopolitan city with a functioning middle class, private businesses, universities, and modern infrastructure. Cubans in 1958 consumed close to 2,700 calories per day on average, among the highest rates in the Americas. Whatever one thinks of the Batista government that Castro overthrew, the economic baseline Cuba started from was genuinely strong. This matters because it removes a common excuse for what happened next. Cuba did not fall into poverty because it was already poor. It fell into poverty from a position of comparative strength in the region, which makes the economic record of the following 6 decades even more revealing as a case study in what central planning actually produces over time. What followed was one of the most comprehensive attempts at central planning ever implemented in the modern world. Within just a few years, virtually all agriculture, industry, and commerce had been nationalized. Prices were set by the state. Wages were set by the state. The rationing system issued every family a booklet called the libreta, specifying how much rice, how much sugar, How many eggs? How much soap they were permitted to buy each month at the state-set price. There was no ambiguity. The central plan told you what you could have and in what quantities. This was socialism applied as thoroughly as it has ever been applied anywhere. For decades, the system was kept alive by massive external subsidies from the Soviet Union. The Soviets bought Cuban sugar at above market prices and sold Cuba petroleum at below market rates. It was, in economic terms, a transfer of wealth from Soviet workers to the Cuban state. Cuba was not generating prosperity through the efficiency of its economic system. It was receiving transferred wealth from a patron that was, itself, running an unsustainable system. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost approximately 80% of its import and export trade almost overnight. The economy contracted by an estimated 35% in just 4 years. This period, officially called the Special Period in Times of Peace by the Cuban government, involved genuine mass deprivation. Ordinary Cubans lost an average of 20 pounds of body weight in the early 1990s. Public transport collapsed. Bicycles became the primary mode of transportation in Havana. Urban farming on rooftops and in unused parking lots became a survival mechanism, not an agricultural philosophy. Cuba found a second patron in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, who began supplying subsidized oil in the early 2000s in exchange for Cuban medical and technical personnel stationed in Venezuela. The life support machine was switched back on under a different brand name, and just as with the Soviet subsidy, it papered over the underlying economic dysfunction without resolving it. When Venezuela's own oil sector began its long decline, Cuban energy supplies fell with it. Sugar production, once the engine of the Cuban economy, fell from over 8 million metric tons in the 1980s to an estimated 200,000 metric tons in 2025, the lowest in over 200 years. As of recent reporting, 7 out of 10 Cubans have been skipping at least one meal a day due to lack of money or food. A quarter of the island's population has emigrated in just the past 5 years. Cuba has spent 66 years demonstrating that the calculation problem does not surrender to belief or dedication. Now observe what all 3 of these cases have in common. The Soviet Union, Zimbabwe, and Cuba were different in almost every dimension. Different continents, different cultures, different histories, different endowments of natural resources, different styles of socialism. The Soviet system emerged from Marxist-Leninist revolutionary theory. Zimbabwe's was rooted in African nationalist politics and post-colonial land reform. Cuba's was the product of a Caribbean revolutionary movement. They were led by very different personalities. Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev in succession in the Soviet Union, Mugabe in Zimbabwe, the Castro brothers across 6 decades in Cuba. They faced different external pressures and enjoyed different periods of external support. And yet, the sequence of events in all 3 is almost identical. First, the state takes control of the means of production and replaces market prices with government prices. Second, shortages begin to emerge because producers no longer have accurate signals about what is needed, where, and at what cost. Third, the government responds to shortages and declining revenues by expanding the money supply, which means printing money. Fourth, inflation accelerates as more money chases a shrinking supply of real goods. Fifth, the government imposes price controls to try to suppress the visible symptoms, which causes producers to stop producing the controlled goods, making shortages worse. Sixth, a parallel economy emerges and grows, where goods trade at real prices in informal markets, often using foreign currency. Seventh, the most skilled, educated, and mobile citizens begin to leave the country. Eighth, the system loses the human capital it most needs to maintain itself. Ninth, it collapses, or survives only through external subsidy, until that subsidy ends. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Socialism is not a fire that burns everything quickly and visibly. It is a river that quietly changes course over years, leaving the old channel dry and barren, while the people living along the old bank keep insisting that the water is simply low this season and will return. This is where history becomes genuinely painful, because the people who bear the heaviest cost in these collapses are almost never the planners who designed the system. They are the ordinary workers and families who believed the promises, organized their lives around the guarantees, and had no backup plan because they had been told none was necessary. In the Soviet collapse of 1991, ordinary wage earners and pensioners who had saved in rubles watched those savings lose most of their value within months. The post-Soviet transition in Russia saw real GDP fall by more than 40% by 1999. Ordinary Russians saw their wages fall by roughly 30%, and their pension values fall by 45% in a single year as the old system of state guarantees dissolved. The privatizations of the 1990s transferred enormous state assets, built over decades by millions of Soviet workers, to a small group of politically connected individuals at a fraction of their true value, creating the oligarch class, which means a class of extraordinarily wealthy individuals who acquired their wealth through political connections rather than through any productive contribution to the economy. The system that promised equality had produced, through its inevitable collapse, some of the most extreme inequality in Russian history. In Zimbabwe, the middle class, those who had managed to accumulate savings over decades of work in the formal economy, found everything destroyed by hyperinflation. A Zimbabwean who had carefully saved the equivalent of $10,000 over 20 years of honest labor found, by 2008, that their savings could not purchase a loaf of bread. The wealth was not redistributed to the poor, it was annihilated. Small business owners who had survived years of socialist restrictions found that by 2008, the price controls made operating legally impossible. They closed. The informal dollar economy survived. But it served primarily those who already had access to US dollars, meaning those with family abroad sending remittances, or those connected to the political and military elite. In Cuba, the bifurcation of the economy became a permanent and visible feature of daily life. A Cuban doctor, one of the most educated and skilled people in the country, earned a state salary of roughly $50 a month. A hotel worker in a tourist resort serving foreign visitors could earn that in a single afternoon in gratuities. The revolution that promised to build a society where your economic position reflected your contribution to the community had instead produced a society where your living standard depended entirely on whether you had access to foreign currency. And foreign currency came primarily from tourists or from relatives who had escaped the system entirely. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat wherever these conditions are created. History has already answered that. The only question worth asking is whether you can recognize the early stages when you encounter them in the world you actually live in. If this channel helps you see these patterns before most people do, subscribe. It costs nothing. And what it gives you is something no official announcement ever will. What does the historical record tell us about the people who navigated these collapses most effectively? Not those who escaped without harm, because for most ordinary people that was not possible, but those who maintained the most stability and rebuilt most quickly? The historical record shows that those who came through these periods in the strongest relative position tended to share three characteristics. First, they maintained some economic connection outside the failing official system. In the Soviet Union, those with access to informal trading networks or who produced food on private garden plots had a buffer that pure wage earners lacked. In Zimbabwe, those with access to US dollars through remittances from family abroad were able to function in the parallel economy when the official one had stopped working. In Cuba, the divide between those with and without dollar access determined basic quality of life more than any other factor. The pattern repeats. Keeping some portion of your economic life outside the official system that is collapsing provided the margin between adequate survival and genuine desperation. Second, those who held tangible physical assets that retained practical value came through periods of currency collapse in considerably better condition than those whose savings existed only in paper currency or bank accounts denominated in the currency that was collapsing. In the Weimar hyperinflation of 1923 Germany, in Zimbabwe's collapse of 2008, and in the post-Soviet chaos of the early 1990s, those who held land, tools, goods that had inherent use preserved something real through periods when paper assets became worthless overnight. The currency could be destroyed, the land could not. Third, and most critically in the long term, those with skills that were portable and recognized as valuable outside the specific system that was collapsing found paths forward that others did not have access to. Cuban doctors left and rebuilt careers in Latin America and Europe. Soviet engineers with technical knowledge found work in the new economies, emerging from the Soviet rubble. Those whose careers had been built entirely within the bureaucratic structure of the old system found themselves with valuable-sounding titles and no market for what they knew. These are observations from the documented historical record. They are pattern recognition, not financial advice, and not a prescription for any individual situation. Now we return to Minsk, to the factory foreman standing near the back of the breadline on March 12, 1991. His name was Alexei. He did not know that cold morning that his country had fewer than 9 months of official existence remaining. He did not know that by December Gorbachev would resign and the Soviet Union would formally cease to exist. He did not know that the pension he had been promised, the security he had been promised, and the economic certainty that had organized every decision of his adult life since he left school was about to dissolve into a chaos of worthless currency, shuttered factories, and a new economic reality for which nothing in his experience had prepared him. His wife kept working as a nurse, but her salary, denominated in rubles, bought less each month. The tractor factory where Alexei had worked for 20 years was privatized in 1993. By 1995, it had been acquired by a politically connected businessman for a price that bore no relation to its actual value. Alexei kept his position for 2 more years, then was laid off in a round of restructuring designed to make the factory profitable. For its new owner in ways it had never been required to be profitable before. He was 50 years old in a country that was simultaneously trying to build a market economy from scratch while managing the social collapse of everything the old system had provided. The expertise he had spent his adult life building was specific to a system that had ceased to exist, and the new system had no clear use for it. His story was the story of millions across the former Soviet space, from Riga to Almaty, from Kiev to Vladivostok. The scale of the suffering was not caused by an earthquake or a war or a plague. It was caused by a system that, from its first day of operation, was working against one of the most basic requirements of how complex economies function. Remove the price signal and you remove the economy's ability to coordinate itself. You replace intelligent, decentralized coordination with centralized guesswork. And over years and decades, the gap between the guesses and reality grows until the entire structure collapses under the accumulated weight of every wrong decision compounding every previous wrong decision. The cracks were not in the walls you could see from the street. They were in the foundations, invisible to the people standing on the floor above them. And by the time they became visible to everyone, it was far too late to shore them up. The ship had already taken on too much water. All that remained was to decide who got to the lifeboats first. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will encounter these ideas and immediately reach for a political objection, or argue that the right version of the system has not been tried yet. But the mechanism described in this video is not a political opinion. It is a documented pattern, confirmed across dozens of countries, on every continent, across every decade of the past 100 years, recorded by economists across the ideological spectrum. If one person in your life is genuinely wrestling with why these systems keep producing the same results, regardless of who leads them, share this with them, not to win an argument, because understanding the mechanism is the only honest starting point for any serious conversation about what kinds of economic organization actually serve the people they claim to serve. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.